Spinoza, also parentheses Leibniz, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. Heidegger writes in Identity and Difference, which is a book that is 2 lectures, which is not very well read, I think, and unfortunately, it's the translation to read is the one by Joan Stanbow, who, or Stanbow, I think, whose translation is probably the most accessible, and also is the standard in the field. Anyway, these were 2 lectures that he gave when he got the rectorship at the university. People were expecting him to give an apology for being a Nazi and for turning in a variety of people to the party. And instead what he did was he gave these 2 lectures. So there was a bit of a shock. However, the lectures are quite interesting, and this is not to make an apology for Heidegger, but it is to say that one should always be careful with whom they sup, and to bear that in mind. And because if you read him in German, especially in the early German, you'll find that it does have that racist sense of purity that's running through it, in the sense that you'll be reading, or that I'm going to give you an outline today. It's been made dirty, or it's got less of that purity thing going on, and it, I think, helps in the context of looking at consciousness and the mind. So I wanted to throw that on the table, and I also wanted to bring to light the way in which Spinoza is understanding the God problem, because I think they're connected in these 2 ways. And I'm hoping that at least part of the discussion today will deal with the question of ethics, not just from the personal view or the individual view of what does it mean to have artificial consciousness, or are people actually being God, and so on and so forth, or is there no use for humans, or that side of the ethics, but actually what does it mean to create an ethical community? So, and the wider question where I think entanglement can be going, if it goes in this direction, I'm not sure if it will. I mean, my work is going in this direction, but doesn't mean entanglement has to go in this direction, which is the way in which a distributed intelligence either may or may not facilitate some form of an ethical community. So I just wanted to throw that out. So in the Heideggerian move that he makes, now I hope that we're all relatively okay now with Hegel and what happened with the question of identity and identity politics and identity period. What Hegel does with identity is that he sets up the question of identity based on the deep cut, based on the abyss, based on the, there's a chair here. In fact, there's 2 chairs. You just have to jump over a couple of people. He deals with the famous deep cut, which Heidegger has a very real problem with. The deep cut, remember, is the slice that differentiates all that there is from all that there's not. And when the not is sublated into the all that there is, and creates the concept, and then the concept comes back around and forms the ground. That whole movement is the structural sort of scaffolding of how thought operates for Hegel, and how it's all one system. Anybody that doesn't get this, do something like nod or weep, something, because this is what we need to, because what Hegel attacks is this position. And one of the reasons, and this is what Foucault attacks, this is what Merleau-Ponty attacks, this is what most of the structuralists are attacking. So, I mean, it's a very serious problem, because what it does in the Hegelian move is it raises the notion of an identity as something that can change, but that it still has an essence to it. So there's no real thing, no one thing called a tree, but if you thought in your mind what a tree looks like, the tree-ness of tree is really what is being referred to, and for Hegel, this essence forms the substance, forms the core of what becomes truth. And that essence can change over time, literally over time, personal, but that one can, but that it's a kind of change that is quite purposeful, so that treeness can never be squirrelness, and squirrelness can never be carness, and so on. You can't actually change within, you might be able to change within the species, let's say, but you can't change outside of that. So it's very important to understand this, and Heidegger is attacking this. Now, in today's contemporary world, a lot of identity politics actually is based on the Hegelian system, much to everyone's dismay, at least mine. So for example, a lot of things around the question of transgender, or on the question of, what does it mean to be woman, what does it mean to be man, this notion of being in the so-called in-between is coming out of a Hegelian mood, deep cut, that all that there is on one side, all that there is on the other side, and this thing in the middle, called the excluded middle, is where a lot of the arguments are situated, which is in the doesn't exist conundrum. And so I want to just point that out, because this notion that there is an essence to being woman, or an essence to being man, or an essence to being trans, or an essence to being any kind of identity is thrown out bizarrely in the Heideggerian move, which is kind of hilarious given the fact that he was Nazi. Well, okay, hilarious is a bit overstating it, but so, and the way he does this is by setting up a thing that is later in our vernacular called a discourse. In his vernacular, it's called an event. And he bases this on a very odd notion of difference. He develops this notion of difference from Spinoza, from Leibniz, from Nietzsche, and from Parmenides. But we don't have to go to all of them at the moment. So in what he basically says, in the attack on Hegel, where Hegel comes up with the notion of identity of all that there is, plus all that there's not, one gets sublated to the other, the sublation causes the synthesis comes back around and forms the ground gives meaning to the two sides, that's the whole picture, you can't get beyond that picture, you can't get outside that picture, that's the picture, that's the whole bit. And Heidegger says that's completely wrong. You have to understand that identity is based on a belonging and a longing to just be. And he says that those are the two poles, as it were, the two aspects, that one is hungry to belong and hungry to be left alone. And one's hungry like this at the same time. And so I'm personalizing it in a certain sense, because he's talking about Dasein, the there, and being, little b being, man or human. So the human wants to belong, so there's a reaching out to belong, and is like, please take me, to belong. And that reaching out to belong, to reaching out there, to throwing one's hunger out there, to be accepted, to belong, requires a certain kind of ability. And that ability he calls techna, which is very typical if you've been in the art world forever. You know that techna is a way of doing something. So the way of belonging, it's not just that I want to belong, just accept me. It's not like that. There's a techna, or as he puts it, a logic of the techna, or in the Heideggerian move, it's called a technology. So that's why he bangs on about, in his question concerning technology, he says technology and the age of technology has nothing to do with technology as such. It's not about computers, it's not about TV or media, although it is, of course. But what it actually is about, in this sense, is that the world in which we live operates off of techna, the ability to grasp. That not every society has always operated this way. In the past, some societies operated this way. In the future, some societies may operate this way. It may not always be the way that the whole society operates off of a grasp of the out there, and the out there is also grasping. So you have the situation of A belongs to A, so the equal sign that takes the A and says that all of these things called A are linked to all these other things called A. I'm sorry that it sounds so pedantic. The equal sign that creates that is a belonging, and that's an attraction. So the first thing you have to understand is that identity is based on attraction. Yes?
Sorry to be even more pedantic, but
Thank you.
when the out there is comes into being, is there a reflective symmetry that then it
No.
looks back or that it grasps back or
Yes, okay, in that sense,
or leaps back?
it's not a symmetry, but there's a leap back, yes.
So it's not a sense of identity and the other side of identity. It's
Right.
It's already some kind of plane or surface or singularity, but it's two different geolocatory positions,
Yes.
both looking at each other in a symmetrical fashion. I don't want to say looking, didn't mean to say that.
Yeah.
Both grasping each other in a symmetrical. There's no.
Now, to put it slightly differently.
There's no principle and no kind of secondary.
Instead of the word grasp, although that's what he's using, because he's
Mm.
talking about techna, let's use the word attraction, because that's a simultaneity that's going on. So it's not so much that it's one does one thing and then it gets reflected back in the other. It's that it's that what makes it work is that there is this immediate, let's say, magnetism. He wants to base this on a form of curiosity, intelligence, just being attracted to something, and you get, and that happens as a fissure, you know, like bzz, it happens together. But it doesn't happen so thoroughly that the A is on top of A and gets cannibalized by the other thing. Because if it does, then obviously there's no identity, there's just, you know, emptiness. So if the A gets so close to the sun that it, you know, to the, you know, gets so close that it gets swept in, then there's no identity. Make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
So another way of visualizing this is that the equal sign of A equals A is actually a bridge. And it's the bridge between one A and the other A, and it symbolizes that they both belong together, but somehow they're also apart. And so the belonging together and the being apart, this is the key. This is the first step of identity. By the way, it's also the first step of 0 and 1 binary algorithms. Just so I throw that in case you already know where we're going with this with shadows of the mind. So the A equals A, the way in which that operates in the first lecture on identity is that this entity is reaching for the out there. Now, why would anyone be reaching for the out there? Just because. It's like, you know, why did you climb the mountain? Because it was there. I mean, it's like one of those kind of things. There doesn't have to be a reason. And in fact, in Heidegger's argument, reason doesn't belong in this argument. It's a different kind of rationality, let's say, or maybe a different type of reason, whichever one works better for you that doesn't bring in instrumental thinking. For him, Hegel is bringing in a certain kind of rationality that precludes creativity and ends up with bureaucracy. And it's not surprising he says this, because even Hegel says this. Hegel says that the highest form of the political is bureaucracy. And it's not surprising that it's a longer conversation of how he gets there, but anyway. For Heidegger, he said that, for Heidegger, art is not the highest form of knowledge, it is knowledge. It's just, but it's a different animal, it's a different way of being than the kind of being that Hegel is talking about, or even for that matter, Marx. So what he's saying is that one uses a certain kind of logic, let's just call it logic for the time being, but we know it's not the logic of the rational, or to put it in the way in which he puts it, it's not the logic of the cogito. You're not actually thinking, I'm gonna go out now and I'm going to meet Mariana and we're going to become friends. You know, it doesn't happen that way either, you know. Either there's a connection or there's not a connection. It's not, you can't think the connection. You can't make the connection happen because of thinking, yeah.
Is it like the encounter that
Yes, it's the
Spinoza talks
encounter.
about, the common notion?
That-
The common notion?
Wait, who talks about?
Spinoza?
Spinoza,
Well,
yes, yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
by
yes.
Deleuze.
Yeah, no, right.
So
So,
in the mixture that happens where one informs the other, but you still maintain your individuality.
yes, because if you encounter to such a degree that you become one, that's no good, because then you don't have the space, as it were. On the other hand, if you think it, then you've already ruined the encounter. You've already brought your own troubles, your own baggage, your own something to the moment, okay? So what Heidegger says is that in order to first understand, like the first law of making sense, like literally producing this thing called sense, making sense, is to understand how this A belongs to A, or how, as I've done this before, you have how this thing, like a scribble, obviously the scribble, they don't look the same, but if you have two different scribbles, I'm saying they belong together because for whatever reasons they are attracted. We could actually put, I don't know, a flake and, water or something, and if they stick together, if somehow the moment works, like, I'm thinking about, some of you are painters and you're like thinking about how it works together when you're not actually thinking, well, I'm gonna really do it like one, paint by color or something like that, or paint by number. It's not gonna work that way. I mean, it might work that way, but it would be, the only reason it works is because this belonging happens. And the belonging happens in such a way that it also retains a separateness.
Doesn't that sort of bring with it a kind of, or leave the way open to kind of God again, of religion to,
Yes.
to magic?
And can you say why?
Well, because you're denying a kind of rational, sort of a Hegelian completeness. You're reintroducing a fuzziness, aren't you, at the edges, so to speak. It's not a complete, the way I'm understanding it anyways, you're kind of bringing back fuzzy, an uncertainty, an element of, I hate to use it, but irrationality.
No, okay, so I'll be clear, so that's not why it brings God in, okay? It does bring God in, but that's not the way it does it.
Okay.
And it also isn't based on some sort of magical moment, that you just, suddenly, it's kind of like, falling in love, gone, disease, fall down a rabbit hole, that's it. It's that there's there is a rationality, it's just not the rational form of rationality. It's not irrational, it's not, and so it doesn't form the outsider type of argument that you have to be sort of slightly crazy or in fact crazy in order to really be an artist or to suffer, this is not, it's not that form of the non-thought. It's a form of not thinking or unthinking. But even to say unthinking already makes it sound like it's not thinking. It's just not having your rational argument in there, figuring things out. You're not figuring to start with. Something, yeah.
It's more about being really present and over time becoming aware.
Yes.
What works.
Yeah. What
for you.
Yeah. How that connection.
Yeah. So you follow what increases your power, what makes you feel better, what makes you more productive, more creative. And in that sense, there's a potentiality, and then in that sense, a closer relationship to infinite, and therefore maybe that's where God comes in.
Let's leave the God question out for a second. Yeah.
Ooh,
Are you
okay.
going to bring God in? Probably.
Yeah, but I wanted to say it in a sort of slightly different way that with the Hegelian system and the sort of its Marxist offshoot, there's this requirement to, it's all grounded by the dynamic, which is the revolutionary, the dynamism,
Yeah.
the struggle in Marx, but the dynamic, that things must negate the thesis and then sublate, and there's a movement. And whether one wants to make that a kind of literal sort of movement in time, it's nonetheless an action. An action is a property of humanity. With Heidegger, there's no There's no duration. Everything is absolutely coheres in a timeless, eternal surface or event, and so that is why there's a kind of, there's an duration, if you like, which does have a certain godlike quality, if that's what you want to. It certainly removes it out of the properties of mankind, because there's no action.
I think that Heidegger would probably be rolling in his grave right now, because, in fact, someone that wrote Being in Time, for example, he does have time right there in it, and he has action in
Yeah,
there.
but it doesn't mean just
Not the kind of
yeah.
action that is the praxis form of action.
Yeah.
So you're not far off on this. It's the way in which one has to understand this is that there's different types of action, let's say, but those actions aren't categories of actions.
Yeah.
They are wholly different forms, or like dimensional forms of action. They're like a totally different animal
Right.
from each other. Yep. Were you saying that? Oh, no.
I think this is what Irigaray rehearses in or repositions in the intimate requires separate dwellings.
Yes.
That she says that, let's say if there's A and A, because she talks exactly about this thing that between one person and another, in order for there to be a bridge between one person and another, and for them to sort of make any understanding of one another, each person has to go into what she calls their own territory and know their own territory, and it's like this resource that they go back into, which is through that they're endlessly discovering themselves, but if they don't do that, then they can't form any relationship.
That's right.
With the other. But I think that because Irigaray took philosophical arguments and replayed them, I think, and I don't know for certain, I think that essay is a replaying of the Heidegger.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, and a slightly more interesting version of it, to be honest.
And what's the essay
That's
start?
right.
What's the essay called?
It's called The Intimate Requires Separate Dwellings.
Yeah. And in fact, yeah, absolutely. And she also has in her book, With and Against Heidegger, it's like the forgetting of air in Heidegger.
No.
It's fabulous. I mean, it's the same idea, because what she's basically saying is that Heidegger, it's kind of what you were getting at too, Barnaby, in the sense that there is movement, there is action, as it were, but it's not erotic, it's not, it doesn't have that same sensuality to it, and so it becomes pure. But for the purposes of trying to see the links between this thing called encounter and event, because that's where we're gonna go with this, and just so you know what you're talking about when you use terms like event, you know that's coming from, or at least the postmodern version of it, it's coming from the Heideggerian move here. It's not enough to say that is what identity is. Identity isn't just this attraction, this belonging, and then wanting to be, as it were, or, and also the way I'm putting it has the issue of intention. And so I'm trying to also try and help you visualize this without an intention. Because eventually we'll get into protons and neutrons, and they don't necessarily have an intention to connect or not connect. So it's not. It doesn't mean that it's without some kind of logic. It's just not the logic that requires thinking as such. It is a logic. There is a rationality. There is a, as Deleuze will later call it, logic of sense. But even saying a logic of sense makes it sound like it's from a more unthought out, that is to say, not able to be clearly articulated. And it's not clearly articulated, so that is the issue, but it's clearly articulated in the sense it can be repeated. And that's always the question about, this is what photography throws up, which is what happens when photography can repeat itself. Is it art? This was always the famous question. If something can repeat itself, yeah.
So it's an unspoken language.
If that helps you understand it that way, yes. It's a logic. It's not really communicating. So language is a bit of a stretch there.
Okay.
I mean, Wittgenstein will call it a language game, emphasis on game. Leotard will also refer to it as just gaming, meaning that that's all there is to it, is the game. There's the mid-game, there's the end game, the start game, and the mid-game, but Leotard's only interested in the mid-game of the game. So just taking, like, if you're taking a urine sample, you take it in the middle of the stream, you don't take, like, that's part of the game, right? That was probably too graphic, but got us there. Okay, now, so Heidegger, and I'm really skipping a lot, but you'll have time to go back and read the Identity and Difference lectures. So in the identity piece, he starts off with Parmenides, and he's talking about how does one begin to use speech and the orality as something that is critical to meaning and to identity. Now, as you know, and again, this is like the hilarity of the Heideggerian move for him. In the Jewish religion, you cannot have an image of something to represent God. If you have an image of God, that's not, you can't have, like, so Jesus isn't God and all the rest of that kind of thing. There's no image for God, and in fact, you can't even pronounce the name of God is Jah or Allah, or, different religions have a place setting to mark the name of God, but no God, no actual God, because God is all powerful and so on and so forth, and all the rest of this. It's also not dissimilar to the way in which he is borrowing from Parmenides around the words of speech or orality, O-R-A-L, like oral, and aural, A-U-R-A-L, as in hearing. So the oral and the aural create sense. And he says that the visual or the logical is the second order of that sense. So he is privileging speech, that is to say orality and aurality, the hearing part of speech and the speaking part of speech, as the way in which one begins to establish meaning. Because for Heidegger, one of the other issues with Hegel is that his notion of identity is premised on representation. What is representation? The re-presenting of the present, the represent. That is to say that the present can never be present in the Hegelian move, because the present, the is always, starts off as, as a not is, as a no thing, as a something that can only be understood through intuition. So it already has to be grasped by this thing called intuition, and that's when you get to the is. But there's no such thing as actually being in the present, hence the excluded middle. But for Heidegger, there's pretty much only the present. And that this thing called being in the present can't be a visual representation. In fact, it can't be a representation at all. It's not being re-presented, it's just being presented over and again. So you could say it is being re-presented, but it's actually presented many times, okay? So another way of putting that is that it's repeated. So the is gets repeated, is. And that re-presenting isn't the same thing as representational. Representational means standing in for something. And so in Hegel's argument, music, for example, and by the way, in today's world that still stands in certain places, music, writing, basically anything that's not pictorial cannot be art. Because it cannot be, because in particular painting, sculpture, there's always a question mark around photography, but anyway, something with an image, that could be art because that would represent. Because representation was the only way to bring forward truth, yes?
Is that a sort of refutation of Kant's.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. Can you explain that? Because some people might not know that.
So very briefly, Kant had a view of the world that there was the world as it really existed, and then the world as it exists in our mind, and that the world as we could conceive it is only a representation.
Okay,
So there's two.
where's he saying this part?
Yeah, is it Critique of Pure Judgment?
Good, wild guess. Okay, we'll let that lie for a second. It's close, it's not quite right, so just,
Okay.
yeah, David?
Is that why Heidegger, I think I just clicked on something, Heidegger is an existentialist, I think?
No,
Heidegger?
well, I shouldn't say no so strongly, not really, I think it's,
Okay.
existentialism comes sort of after Heidegger,
But in the
or maybe
sense that it
at the
doesn't-
same time.
Nothing can represent. What you see, hear, or smell is what there kind of is all there is. That's
It's
what-
not so much that it is all there is, it's that the is can only be, that the is inhabitable. As Emma was saying, it's a dwelling, the is a dwelling,
Okay.
which he gets to by talking about how one sets up a dwelling in this relation between wanting to be alone and belonging. That relationship, or the Dasein and the entity, creates this, let's just picture two poles, one being, let's say, entity, the other being Dasein, and the strength between them, the connection and the separation between them creates this thing called discourse. And that's the, and so don't picture in your mind like one little person on the shore and then one big Dasein on the ocean, like a big ship or something. And I mean, that's how I'm explaining to you, but that, picture instead like a collective, I don't know, fog on one end and a collective fog on the other, and they're stuck together. And that energy creates their connection, as it were, that keeps them apart and together. This is what a discourse is. And for Heidegger, the reason the reason he goes to God on this question, although I'm skipping a few things, never mind, I'm not gonna tell you this part, that'll just confuse you more. Okay, so at the moment, we're at this A equals A, and the equal sign is such that I've got the A equals A, and what I'm showing here is an equal sign that is in the middle of both A's, and the A's are on either side of the equal sign. But you could, in fact, make the equal sign so that the top of the A is equal to the bottom part of the A. And in this sense, the discourse is here. And what Einstein does, very brilliantly, of course, is, because what Heidegger, sorry, I jumped again. What Heidegger does here is he says that we still haven't figured out how identity exists. I'll forget about Einstein in a moment, I forgot a whole section. What we need to figure out, this is how a very basic form of belonging and not belonging that creates one sliver of identity begins to get formed. But he says, but in reality what gets formed is the repetition of this presenting. And to create the repetition of the presenting means that you have to understand how something is undecidable. I'm going to use the term undecidable even though he doesn't use the term undecidable. Gödel uses the term undecidable, G-O-D-E-L, with the umlaut over the O. And Kurt Gödel, came up with the principle of undecidability. And what the principle of undecidability said was that in any system, complex or simple, but even in the most simple systems, like 1 + 1 is 2 system, a very basic arithmetic, they're always undecidable. Not indecidable, not indecisive, undecidable. And in fact, for the longest time, when Kurt Gödel wasn't well known, people would always correct the undecidable to make it indecidable. And you'll see certain translations as indecidable when it's actually undecidable. So just remember, it's not a real word. It's something that can't become a word. Okay? It's something that can't become something. It's not able to be finished. and it's got some sort of openness. So the idea of a discourse is premised on the fact that it's undecidable. Now Derrida takes this undecidability to great lengths. But I'll get to that later. But this undecidability, the reason this is critical here is that when you think of an edge of a discourse, the edge of a discourse is undecidable. The limit of a discourse is undecidable. It's neither here nor not here. It's neither yes or not yes. It isn't dialectical, it's undecidable. And yet it exists as a limit. So what Heidegger is saying is that you have this A equals A, and I've now drawn the equal sign to be on the top A and the bottom part of the A, and that creates the discourse. But that discourse actually has some kind of, I'm drawing it as a bit of a circle, you know, the discourse, picturing a discourse like, I don't know, a circle. The edges of that circle form the discourse, but that's an undecidable edge. Does that in any way make sense? Well, that undecidability is what Heidegger develops as difference. And difference is actually what gives identity its identity. So, but it's not the difference of like diversity difference. It's this undecidable difference. Yes.
It sounds like it. It's not. But it's, I think it's easy to think about it as being binary. Like you.
It's definitely not binary.
Because there's like you because of the opposite, but it's
Right.
not because it's undecidable. So
Yes.
it shift that edge moves basically.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. It's elastic and bouncy.
It's bouncy.
Okay.
It's a bouncy castle. It's a bouncy undecidable.
Does the word continuum help? Is that-
No, because that's a connected.
Ah.
So the undecidable isn't, you know what actually helps? I mean, well, maybe it doesn't help, but I'm gonna throw it out, because there's another word for that, undecidable. Does anybody, Despina, do you have an idea of what that other word is? Starts with Z. Z, zero.
Zero.
That's right. Contingent? It's like, yeah, that starts with a Z. That's all right, no, I'm just kidding you there. Zero. The zero is the undecidable. And the zero isn't in a lot of works. Hello. That's right. The zero, and what's interesting about the zero is that conceptually, at least in our culture, a zero is drawn as a circle. But in fact, it could equally be drawn as an equal sign. Or even a handshake, I guess. It can be drawn as something that connects and doesn't connect. So there's a bag of something coming this way. What is it? Well, don't give it to me. Pass it around. What is it?
It's some gluten-free brownies and cakes.
Oh, wow. Pass it out.
I want it now.
And coffee.
No.
No.
Oh no, coffee. It's
Past
just my
tense.
coffee. You can just leave it there.
That's a lot
Oh,
of
pass the coffee
brownies.
back.
Coffee bag.
Yeah, pass the coffee
Yeah,
back. Yeah.
It's empty.
Yeah, I know.
Oh.
Need it.
Okay.
Just use it through.
Okay. We'll just wait for this commercial interruption.
And here we have some very
Sorry.
colorful cake.
Is
No,
there a way
no, 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 no.
No,
Yeah.
it is not.
Yeah.
Yeah. No.
Okay, we need to, can someone grab a knife?
There is a knife there. There's
Oh,
like
yeah, I thought I
knives
felt
there.
something.
Bloody hell. That's great. If someone can cut them into little pieces and then pass them around.
It's like the balloon.
That's right.
Okay.
Okay,
Just gonna give these to next to me and
Yeah,
pass the
yeah.
rest.
Okay, now back to thinking about what we're thinking about. Adam, did you want to say something?
Just explaining.
No, you're just waiting for your plane. Okay,
Can I just ask you about this idea of the zero being redrawn? Just
mhm.
is that is the philosopher that I'm in communication with, scientist, is believes that zero doesn't exist at all, that there's no value for it. It's a really bad way of saying it.
Well, it's pretty much the case. So, is the zero God? That was cruel and wrong. I'm so excited, thank you for bringing this.
When Leotard says that somebody should model the zero, is this the same zero that he's talking about?
I mean, to the degree to which zero is can shapeshift.
Okay, can start.
Okay, yeah, just pass around all these chocolate, all this sugar, it's great, excellent,
I'm gonna cut this one and
okay. Okay, try and focus people. Okay, while you're coming up with this, just remember at the moment that we have this word called difference that I've brought to bear. And that taken together, identity and difference forms the event. So a discourse by itself, well, just like a concept, I was gonna say a discourse by itself can't be an event, but that's not quite true. Just like in the Hegelian situation, that which, just like in the Hegelian situation, that which cannot, that, you know, if you have an abstract position, let's say the thesis, but you don't have the antithesis connected to it, then it's just, it's an abstract form.
I can
Hilarious. Right, just get as much sugar as you need, and then we'll continue. Okay, I'm totally happy about this.
So this is my identity and that's my difference.
No,
And this is creating an event. No.
no. Okay, no, all good, fine. No,
Yeah, surely the word identity implies difference, doesn't it? Otherwise, why would you bother inventing the word identity, or using the word identity, if there wasn't a difference?
Sorry?
Do I?
well, because the problem here is that there's this thing called identity, which is situated on this precipice of belonging and wanting to be. And that form of identity clearly has some sort of, let's say, air in it, you know, that allows for the very first situating of this equal sign between all the, you know, the out there and the other side kind of thing. But that's not the whole picture. In fact, that's a very limited sense of the picture, because what he's saying is that there's this element that needs to be accounted for, but I'm calling it an element already, that's wrong, because it sounds like it's a something. That's why the two pieces of cake are not, one's not difference and the other one's identity. It's not like one thing is called an identity and the other thing is called a difference. Difference is undecidable, unnameable would be another way of putting it, except that's not a good way of putting it, because in fact it is nameable, it's just undecidable. So the undecidable enables movement, because it means that there's no closure ever. And if there were closure, you'd have a black hole. You'd have dark matter. And as it turns out, you do get dark matter. So in fact, you can have, you know,
You'd have one song only.
yeah, that'd be a
Ever.
singularity, yeah.
Yeah.
So would decidable be same as containable and undecidable and uncontainable?
No, you're still thinking in pictures.
Did you say you haven't seen that?
Try not to think in
I'm
pictures.
sorry.
Try to think in
Okay.
dimensions.
Because you couldn't change the note.
Would hypnotize you.
The number one.
Where is temporality here?
Leave
The
temporality
tempora-
alone. Leave it alone. So let's
Okay.
just see if we can just get to, well, we could talk about temporality in the sense of duration,
Okay.
but to be honest, the form that Barnaby was speaking about, that form of time doesn't exist, as Einstein proves. But of course, we know it exists because we get to places on time. So we use something that we can call time, even if it's not the kind of time that is, you know, even though it's an artificial construction.
But didn't Gödel mean that actually, okay, you can get on to your appointment on time, but it's never actually on the spot of
Time.
definable time. And the number one can never be defined exactly. There's no beginning, middle or end of the number one. It's a kind of arbitrary place.
No,
Isn't that what
No.
undecidable?
no, but it's a good way of thinking about it on some level. No, the undecidable is because of the system. So even in simple systems, the undecidable creates the movement of meaning. So you okay? Yeah,
Gotta go this way.
okay, that's right.
Can I just say that my version of time does exist as long as folk are standing on the same object with the same gravitational mass.
Thank you for that.
There you go.
Okay, this, yeah,
Just something, it's a while ago that I read the Identity and Difference, so
Okay.
just to refresh and to make clear. I thought like also the whole point was that somehow difference, because that's confusing me a bit with the limits of the discourse and all this kind of thing. The difference isn't actually something that is external to a thing.
right, it's not
But-
external.
Yeah, so it's already in there. It's not like an antithesis in
Right.
that sense.
Yeah.
It's actually part
It's in
of
the
it.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Huh?
But it's how language plays. It's the game of language, in a sense. That's the difference. That's what the discourse is as well. But how meanings of words change over time, because they're not. That is the movement. There is no closure with meaning and language, and that's the difference. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Let's just leave language off as well.
Okay.
It's not discourse in language, I don't think it's kind of
Yeah,
paralinguistic.
let's leave that off just for the
Okay.
time being.
Okay.
We can go back to the linguistic turn, because that's a very big thing, you know. But see, the problem is that the reason I want to direct you sort of away from language is because the linguistic turn itself brings us back into concept.
Yeah, and it ties
And this
it.
is not about concept. This is for those artists and philosophers who bang on about the fact they want to get away from the concept. This is how it's being done. This is how one gets away from the concept and still has something that is making sense without just being someone's opinion. Because the whole trick, as it were, their whole approach is to try and figure out how can one make a claim or make something stick, even if it's for at least a nanosecond. How does that happen? How does the happening happen? I don't know if that's making sense either.
So why is it, in other words, why is it A equals A rather than A?
Yes, right,
Yeah, or just
yes. In fact, that's a very good way of putting it. Why is it A equals A instead of just this thing A? Why is it not just A? And the answer is because the start is always plural. That's where we get there. And because it's not many, it's plural, which is different than many. Because it's plural, the plural is what speaks to this thing.
Does that relate to Spinoza's idea of paternity?
Yes, we're gonna get to that
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
just a second, yeah. So you can see where he's getting
Yeah.
all this from, yeah, Dario.
Well, just about the unlisted growth.
Can you say it louder, because we can't hear you in here?
the undecidable of Gödel, actually, when you're saying about what about this limit, I think it's also important to understand that if you think of that system, no matter how simple the system is, that you can say a true statement about the system without being able to prove it within the system.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
For
What Gödel
example,
means by that?
you can have a set of axioms, sort of like with Spinoza, where actually mathematical axioms,
Yeah.
and they define a system in computational or algorithmic ways. So we can derive extremely many rules from these set of axioms. But yet at the same time we can say something about that system, which would be like, for example, this sentence is not provable, but it's true.
Yeah.
So we realize that this sentence is not provable within the system, because if it was provable, it wouldn't be true. And this is how the Gödel's theorem came to by finding out that this one sentence for natural numbers, it became clear there is no possibility of making this system completely closed. So it cannot know everything about itself through the rules or through the rules which system exists.
Okay. I'm not sure if people were following that, but
It's
that's
not
right.
easy to actually understand,
Yeah.
because
I'm going to throw something out to see if this makes it clearer, but it might make it worse. So I'm sorry about that, and then we'll go to Spinoza. I'm just waiting for David to get back really. Which is, do you think that it is fair to say that for a work of art to be art, not that I'm someone who cares if it's called art, but anyway, skipping that for a second, that it is always undecidable, and when it isn't, it's not art. So if it presents itself as, if it's somehow the thing you're dealing with is closed, whatever that means and however it presents itself, it cannot function as a work of art. And that this is Heidegger's argument. So for art to be art, it has to work, literally go to work. It has to do something. And what it does is remain undecidable. And that's what makes it work, what makes it have the work of art. The work of art is working.
That's all.
But it's undecidable. It's not quite the same thing. Which doesn't mean it's not resolvable, although probably is not resolvable. So sometimes, for example, if a machine is drawing, a lot of times people will say, well, that's just not art, not because a human didn't do it, but because it's so resolved. There's nothing undecidable about it, something like that. Or design, or when you're doing something that's a project, this thing that has a beginning, middle, and end. There's something that's very straightforward about it. Yeah, Jasmina?
Is it about functionality, purposefulness?
Can you put that in a way that's not a question?
So, in the sense that, and I think you mentioned that last week, design is about a certain function, it has to perform a certain function. And the function is very concrete, very set. So there's also a criteria of success. Whereas in art, to say, oh, it succeeded to make you understand infinity and transcendence or whatever is the concept, there's not such a limit of success or function of destination.
So, yeah.
I mean, I was reading this kind of, it's the kind of machines that think, the
Yeah.
kind of, AI for dummies from the Inquirer series, and there's a chapter that discusses why machine art is not attractive to humans. And it's the argument that it puts forward is that it revolves around this idea that if a human made it, there is a pleasure in thinking that you could somehow figure out the journey, and that it would be relatable. Whereas if an AI writes a poem or something like that, then in the general understanding, there's nothing that you can figure out in a relatable way. So that's why you're feeling kind of like there's nothing there to look at unless something else.
But if you
comes
didn't
together,
know an
then yeah.
AI creature did it,
No, exactly. But I think it's that kind of questions around why people are not responding to computer art, if they know it the same way, and of course people are constantly fooled, and there's other reasons to engage with it. But I just never thought about it that way, that people feel cheated because the expectation with a work of art is somehow that you could sort of join the process of the artist, and if the artist is not human, then you're barred
Yeah.
from that
Do you
a
think that that's
priori or something.
that was the case with photography as well? I mean, certainly early photography, I mean, I would think that people would have an issue, photography is always consigned to the documenting of the capturing of history or the capturing of a moment.
I mean, I
Not
don't
any
think
longer, but it used to be.
I don't think this argument really holds or
No.
works, but I think it works in the sense that there is a popular conception of this sort of romance of art that mystifies it, and that for most people that needs to be there, and I think we could kind of we could obviously already earlier question what we mean by art and all this kind of stuff, but I think it makes sense in a kind of more broader cultural phenomenon sort of way.
That idea about photography being a document, like it records what's really there.
I'm not agreeing with it.
No, but I'm, well, okay, so it makes me think about, there's this book which is called London Labour and the London Poor, and I don't know if anybody knows it, but it's by Thomas Mayhew, and one section of it is him interviewing people working in London in the late 19th century, and their sort of accounts of people's work in their own words, and there's a man who runs a photographic studio, and it's at a point in time where photography becomes appealing to a population because they know that it records what they look like. But this photographic studio takes photographs, and sometimes they don't come out because of the plagues. So what they do is then hand over a photograph of someone else to the person who's paid to have their portrait taken. And many times people say, okay, thanks, and go away with this photograph of someone else.
That's fabulous.
And they said that, in the interview they asked, is there ever a case where, someone recognises that it's not them? And they said, well, yeah, actually someone came back with their photograph and said, this isn't me. And these kind of scammy photographers are trying to say, yeah, that's you. And so I said, yeah, but this person's holding a baby. I don't have a baby. And what's interesting about that, apart from that, is the funny story, is that as technology and illusion advances, there's a sense of not knowing what it is you're looking at. So not knowing not being able to complete the thing that makes up what it is or how it got made. And in not knowing that, the illusion is so much bigger, so much more convincing. But once you know how it operates, and you can imagine that route, then you can say, well, that's ridiculous. That would never, not only do we have a sense of what we look like in a different way, but, it doesn't make sense that this person...
Does everybody know about the hidden mothers, the photographs of the hidden mothers?
Oh, yeah.
That's
strange.
so great, yeah. So in the olden days, like 10 years ago, when they were trying to take pictures of babies, and the babies, they couldn't be without the mother, they would put a Persian carpet, not something light, but this
heavy thing over this woman would be the mother, and the child would be sitting on the carpet, but the mother would be holding it. And so it looks, these are
On the lap.
on the lap.
Mother, it's like,
It is just the most amazing, if you have a chance to look at these things, they're just, it is quite, yeah, that's it, yeah. The hidden mother photographs, I mean, it's just like completely mental.
But the idea that you wouldn't see,
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
that's what I
absolutely.
mean about illusion, is that
But that's also the case when you
Oh,
think about exhibitions. A lot of times, when I've looked at people's work and I'll say, well, is the wall part of the exhibition? They go, oh, no, just the piece that's here. I was like, well, you should think about the wall because it is actually part of the exhibition, in fact, you know, and that it actually comes in, but you can erase it in a certain sense, or you can set it up in such a way that you don't really see it, or it's not really important to whatever the story is. I mean, that kind of thing, you know, like, for example, this room, by the way, bring in your stuff, please. I mean, we've got, Diego has brought in one of his pieces of work, which we're gonna hang somehow. This is what is this? It's a thing, thank you.
That's part of an installation, we do several of them. It's a piece of quartz crystal ball in the middle, and I felt it around from raw wool. And the slit wasn't here in the beginning, it became in the process. But it's all about the process and getting somewhere when you are concentrated in that moment of suspension of time, if you want to say.
Okay.
So I'm interested in that moment of connection with.
Good, okay, well, you can pass it around if you want, but anyway, we're gonna figure out where to put it.
Yeah,
And don't forget to bring your artwork in, because this is your room, right? So we gotta, I mean, honestly, look at it. I realize that we're like trying to just be, you know, don't see anything, but it'd be really good to have some stuff up. Okay,
Can I ask what you meant when you said the thing under the thing, or the work of art or the piece of art under consideration cannot be closed. It must be undecidable, which makes it work. When you say work there, do you mean it makes it cohere, or do you mean makes it?
Makes it cohere and also push away
But
simultaneously.
but the thing doesn't. It's not made to take action. It's not like working.
No, it's not
as
like
in,
walking along or something.
I mean, I don't mean literally, but I mean it doesn't. It doesn't start task. Do that.
Doesn't
I mean,
what?
I'm just confused by the. All becomes clear now. Just the sense which work, whether you mean working as in labouring, or whether you mean working as in making sense or cohering, you know, as in being effective.
Yes,
Which one?
both.
Oh.
It reminded me of Clement Greenberg talking about
Sorry.
abstract expressionism. Like, because, you know, there's that whole
I
thing
failed you.
but it either works or it doesn't. And being lost in the work because it's contemplative, because that's the whole. But then
I
that
don't
kind of
know
linked
if,
it reminded me of that anyway.
yeah,
I know you're vomiting, but
Yes,
sorry about
that's
that.
right, that's right.
And in what way does the undecidable make something work in either sense of the word? I mean, what?
That's the real question, isn't it?
Yeah. I
Because
mean,
it keeps it moving.
but why does undecidability prompt movement?
No, let's put it slightly differently.
Operation, not necessarily movement.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's put it even more different again. Let's say that actually the question isn't why does undecidability do X, Y, and Z, but the question is, how is it that you start with a plurality and not with a singular? That's what it is. Okay, and one has to get the fact that if you have this plural thing going on, and you're able to make that somehow in the work, as it were, it will work in a way that if you do, let's say, paint by numbers, the word I can think of at the moment, sorry about this, or like I was just watching, because I'm in the middle of trying to fix this house that I'm getting, I'm choosing like the cheapest forms of kitchen things I can find. And what they do is they send you videos of what works and doesn't work. I would not say that any of these operate on any level as something that could even begin to become art. They're just this like infomercials type of thing. Now, that is not because, one of the reasons I'm trying to raise this without raising the horrible question of what is art, is that it doesn't work at the level of creating this cohesive undecidability that allows for yourself to get involved with it as opposed to stand on the edges. It creates an encounter when it works.
Duchamp's urinal is not Duchamp's urinal when it's a urinal plumbed into the toilets of the toilet.
Yeah,
It's the urinal and the arm signature and the fact that it's in the art gallery. The, sorry, go on.
Oh, so I was going. So you could perhaps a better term would be seduces.
seduces is fine.
Yeah, rather than work.
But
I mean,
would
know.
you want to say that energy seduces mass velocity squared? Maybe, but where we're going with this is we're gonna get to the kind of encounter that doesn't matter what the endpoints are, let's say. What matters is that there's a cohesion. So the thing about relativity is not so much that anything can happen in any direction. It's that anything can happen given that this cohesion is created. Or to put it a different way, because it's starting like here and creating the cohesion. There's this cohesion, what makes it stay cohesive? Start with the plurality and move outward. Start with it, and by plurality, it means both identity and difference, not identity or difference. Or by plurality, it doesn't mean having difference in your thing. It means that the whole thing is taken together. And you can't, okay, I feel that we're still not there yet. So what I'm trying to get at here is how one understands how a surface operates. And the surface isn't something that necessarily is attached to a structure as it was in Newtonian physics. So a surface of a building or surface of the table is attached to the table. Or in the Heideggerian move, the surface of the discourse is attached to the A's. But in quantum physics and in artificial intelligence, it isn't attached to a structure. It just is. That maybe ruined it as opposed to clarified it. But so the idea here is that Heidegger couldn't figure out how to do what he called a groundless ground, because what he was so incensed about with Hegel was this question of the essence, which is funny, like I said, given it was Heidegger. But he didn't think there was a substance that ran through, because that was too theological. That was like having God run through everything. And he was trying to get rid of God on one level at least, on the level of running through everything, because some groups didn't have God in them, that they weren't godly enough. Surprise. So he was trying to get rid of this essence thing, but he kept coming up against the problem that he couldn't get rid of his A's, because if he dropped the A's, he would drop a structure. So how would it stand? So he had to call in God as an ontic, as a grounding force. And that's what's called the ontotheologic in Heidegger. The ontotheologic is the move that creates the famous groundless ground. And the reason one has a groundless ground is because one is trying not to impose meaning on something.
Where's Shannon? This, when we talk
I
about
know.
Shannon, where's Shannon?
I don't
This
know.
is Shannon's.
This is Shannon's thing. She's off trying to write her thing
Yeah.
and not here.
Sorry, but that's so appropriate. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's right. So, so what Einstein does, which Heidegger couldn't do, is he gets rid of the endpoints. And he says that the way in which relativity operates, in fact, for that matter, the way in which any of this stuff operates, is that somehow, the question is how, but somehow attraction creates the discourse. So you start with the discourse, you start with the plurality, you start with, I say plurality because, but you could use multiplicity, it's just that multiplicity ends up sounding like many, when in fact it's manifold rather than many. Is that even more muddy or no?
That's the Karen Barad sort of position.
Now we're getting to Karen Barad, yeah.
So the somehow would be the undecidability. No.
Yeah, well, yes,
Yes. No.
but you have to present this not as a question, but as a, put it again, but
I'm absolutely
make your
certain
case.
that the undecidable element is the somehow. Not really.
Okay, that was a really good argument there. Thank you very much.
The problem is with the Einstein position is that I don't see that there's any that your surface. I can't help but think there's a tension, a surface tension, and this is a cohesion. And without the two endpoints, or without some endpoints, it misses that, and it becomes a sort of soup.
Exactly. It's like, how do you differentiate between discourses when discourses don't have these positions that sort of
Yeah.
So is it time now to turn either back to Penrose or to Heidegger, to the actual work? Because maybe now we're just so, I just want to give you like I say, the scaffolding of, yeah, Grant?
Does that, when you talked about Heidegger saying that, oh God, what's, like, all there is the present, is that what Einstein is saying, though? Like, that's all there can be. So they're both saying the same thing, but Heidegger doesn't, he doesn't understand it fully because he needs that
Well,
kind of the God
theological.
thing. Yeah, the onto-theological. Whereas Einstein doesn't, because he's coming at it
Well,
from a
but
different-
Einstein is more Spinozian than,
Yeah.
so God is everywhere,
in everything.
in everything.
Thank you.
But I mean, let's face it, Spinoza was an atheist, so I mean, that he's saying that God is everywhere is again that God is nowhere. So I mean, there's that sort of, it wasn't by accident he was thrown out of all the synagogues and everything at the time. But so let me see if I can put it slightly differently, because at the moment it's just so broadly put that you're getting the general shape. It's like being next to an elephant trying to talk about like what you're feeling, and this one feels like that and that one feels like that.
In the dark.
Yeah, so it's not quite right. Shall we go to Spinoza? Maybe that's better to go, what would be better, to tackle the Spinoza question to figure out how the discourses operate, or to tackle the Heideggerian move, or to tackle the Penrose, which would be easier? What would you want?
Spinoza.
Spinoza, okay. I'm hoping my computer will now work. What's that?
You came
Oh,
back.
we'll never get it. I don't know why this has done this. For some reason my computer decided to go to Siri.
I really thought that
The
Descartes
ethics.
was bad.
I'm sorry, Prof, I'm afraid I can't do that. Okay.
Maybe somewhere in accessibility. Maybe in accessibility.
Yeah, that's right, I'm just gonna go to Dropbox, just find it that way. Wow. Okay, does anybody have the ethics with them? That I can look at?
I have the ethics with me.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Let's just go. All right. So, if we look at I don't wanna go this, well, maybe we should do one by one. Okay. What proposition shall we talk about? Because I think that, okay, let's start with proposition one. That's always a good place to start. So proposition one, substance is by nature prior to its affections.
It just is.
It just is. Substance is by nature prior to its affections. So the question is, do you understand this, as Grant has correctly identified?
Sorry.
No, as you have correctly said, as that it is the is, or do you understand substance as an element prior to this thing called affection?
Sorry.
It's the is
I'm sticking with is, you know.
Because it comes before. It's a kind of the complication between the kind of like the virtual and sorry, we can't use that word. Like the real matter substance and then being, which is
Okay, we're just gonna, anybody else other than Grant? Give it a go. D?
It's a thing that needs no other thing to exist.
A thing that needs no other thing. So nobody is suggesting that this thing called substance is an element, like an ingredient, like Nigella's seed, which I cooked with last night.
Nigella's
This is happening from D3. If you look at
What's
it-
it now? What's it now?
Well, the P1 is coming from D3 and D5. And
Okay.
D3 is saying the substance, I understand what is in itself and is conceived through itself, that is, that whose concept does not require the concept of another thing from which it must be formed.
Okay, so let's go to, okay, I was trying not for us to read the definition.
Okay.
No, that's right, that's right. But what does that mean? It's what I'm trying to make sure that you're understanding. Maybe everybody's got this, so that's fantastic. Because Grant has already been correct in his assumption, but in what way is a substance not an element? Or not, peppercorn, or, Nigella seeds, by the way, delicious.
I mean, in a way, it relates back to what you said about Einstein, like taking the endpoints off. You don't need to prefigure.
Right, okay, so as
it
long as
just
we're on the
is.
same page on
That's
this,
my understanding.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
is it everybody's understanding?
and it has infinite attributes. What was that?
Yes,
Yeah.
if it has infinite attributes, how does one understand this thing infinite? What do you need, we were talking about this today in the tutorial, what do you need to have the infinite attribute?
The God particle.
You do need the God particle, it's true, but, I mean, from Spinoza, what do you
We just have here that the attributes are multiple expressions, and we only know two of them, which is the extension and thought.
Okay, that's
The physical
a good
reality
stab.
and
Yeah, okay, so if the infinite is this, how do you picture the infinite? What does it look like, the sky, or does it look like, the dark sky, does it have stars in it? Is it like, I don't know, Jesus, what's the infinite look like? Does it look like anything? Can you?
But that's the thing, it's beyond conceptualization in a sense. That's the horror of it.
It's Roscoe.
Okay, a thing is said to be finite in its own kind when it can be limited, this is number 2, by another thing of the same nature. For example, a body is said to be finite because we can always conceive of another body greater than it. So too, a thought is limited by another thought, but body is not limited by thought nor thought by body. Okay. 3, by substance, as Dario pointed out, I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. That is, that the conception of which that is, that the conception of which does not require the conception of another thing from which it has been formed. By attribute, I mean that which the intellect perceives of substance as constituting its essence. So what would be an attribute of substance? That's really what I'm trying to get at. Kate? No. No, it's just no.
Nature.
What would be like? Would it be any kind of being or thing?
Yes, anything would be an attribute of the substance. Because the only way to think the infinite is to think of a thing in order to give the infinite some kind of body, let's say, because otherwise the infinite is a blob.
But it is a materiality. It's
yes, not a blob.
substance.
Yeah.
It's not concept or abstract or anything else. There's a materiality. It's an infinite material.
Yeah. And so what does material mean here?
well, no, exactly that. It's got it's got an unlimited amount of physicality. So anything can be an attribute of the substance, provided it's got a certain degree of materiality to it.
Is it maths?
No, go there.
No, so
And
not maths.
also, don't raise a question. Say this very respectfully. If you think you know what it should be, or you're even questioning what it should be, present it as an argument, as opposed to presenting it as a question. I don't mean argument like you have to have a fight with somebody. I mean like a position. Yeah, Grant?
I believe it
Yes.
is how we conceptualize and categorize and name things. That's what I believe.
Okay. And is there
That's my
some-
queen again on the table.
That's right. Okay. That's right. Thank you for the queens. Yes.
Is that right?
Okay, you're not supposed to ask a question. You have to.
Oh, I don't know. I'm like,
You have
oh no, the elephant in the dark room.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Anya,
But I
what
can't
were you
think.
gonna say?
No, I mean, I really understood it quite literally as a substance is a substance, a material
Let me ask you this.
thing out of which
That's
all of
happy.
us and everything is made.
Okay, so
Yeah.
can you talk about this in relationship to Catherine and Hales somehow?
Yes, in the sense that, I mean, I was reading the Deleuze Spinoza Practical Philosophy.
Yes, that's actually quite a good book.
And I was reading the introduction, and there's one thing that quite directly carries over to the Catherine Hales. Just gonna find it. So basically, in chapter 2, on the difference between the ethics and amorality, on page 17.
Sorry, which translation is this?
This is translation. Who made it?
Yeah, it's Hurley.
City Lights. Yeah.
Okay, so it must be Hurley. Yeah, okay.
For some reason, I'm not seeing who translated it, but it's the it's the City Lights
Robert Hurley,
edition
yeah.
from 1988. So page 17. Deleuze talks about Spinoza offering philosophers a new model, the body. And he quotes from the Ethics, and basically what Spinoza says, we do not even know what the body can do. And then Deleuze goes into this idea of parallelism in Spinoza, which is on page 18, which he says it does not consist merely in denying any real causality between the mind and the body. It disallows any primacy of one over the other. And he explains that basically what happens is if we don't really know what the body can do, by finding out what the body could do, we can also then find out in parallel what the mind could do. And the two of them belong together. So it says here in the middle of the page, what does Spinoza mean when he invites us to take the body as a model? It is a matter of showing that the body surpasses the knowledge that we have of it, and that thought likewise surpasses the consciousness that we have of it. And a little bit further down, he says, one seeks to acquire knowledge of the powers of the body in order to discover, in parallel fashion, the powers of the mind that elude consciousness, and thus to be able to compare the powers. And he follows that up and says, in short, the model of the body, according to Spinoza, does not imply any devaluation of thought in relation to extension, but much more important, a devaluation of consciousness in relation to thought, a discovery of the unconscious, of an unconscious of thought, just as profound as the unknown of the body. And so in that sense, and it relates very much, I think, to unthought. Again, like here, the idea of consciousness in Spinoza is described as consciousness is by nature the locus of an illusion, not just that it's not just that it produces illusions and it could produce something else. Its very nature essentially is, let's see where he says that. he says at some point that basically illusion really constitutes what consciousness is and what it does, because consciousness is only ever aware of effects but not of causes. So there is an interesting kind of, there's an interesting correlation there with Catherine Hale's claim that a lot of the decisions and how things get processed by consciousness are just a sort of narrative put upon kind of rare facts or inputs that are processed by the non-conscious cognition that we just have no access to whatsoever. It's not even like the unconsciousness of Freud that we could kind of get to, like our consciousness would be totally overwhelmed if we had any access to it.
Is it in Hales that she writes that the identity is an illusion, that our concept of identity or even the self is an illusion of the conscious mind?
She quotes from some kind of neuroscientist kind of guy that has that talks totally about the self being a complete fabrication that just helps the organism to survive. It's just one of these ways of creating a survival strategy, and it could be different in other organisms and is. But she's not necessarily saying that she buys into that, but she sort of puts it in there as like saying you could go as far as saying that. I mean, I think, though, what I'm wondering is, and I don't know enough about Spinoza yet to get there or to make this argument properly, is to what extent Catherine Hales is still really kind of caught in a scientific positivism that is full of information about neuroscience and physics and quantum physics and all these kind of other things that Spinoza didn't have access to. So he's just imagining these things. And whereas Hales really tries to argue these things sort of somewhat scientifically through facts that have been established in the empirical sciences. Spinoza is not, it's an ethical and philosophical proposition, and probably the ethical part of it is dependent on it being philosophical rather than
abstracted,
empirical.
So, sorry.
I just wanted to add, because we said what would be an attribute of substance, and we sort of came to the answer of anything would be an attribute of substance, but related to Hales as well, it would be anything plural. Would be a...
So the anything is not a singular anything.
Exactly.
It's a multiple anything. There's a plural anything.
Yeah. And I wanted to add that.
Yeah, and can you elaborate on that?
Well, when we were talking about substance, it made me think of if anything plurally would be an attribute of substance, then we could call it distributed intelligence as well. Or this apopoiesis, which Hales sort of described as a being producing a being which hasn't existed before. But that happens plurally.
Yeah, that's good. Then try it again. Try. Where are we going with this? Apopoiesis?
Let me just look at my notes. So it's not a being, it's an activity in which a being brings something into being that did not exist before.
Okay, so what's the mileage you think that Hales / Heidegger is getting from the term poiesis, or even poetics, which is not quite the same thing, but what is this poiesis? What is that? Does anyone know what poiesis is? Or poetics?
Bringing it to being.
Bringing it to being. And how does that happen? How does something get brought into being from the Heideggerian perspective? From the very first things we were talking about at the opening of the seminar. Techna.
Oh,
Good. Okay, so Heidegger goes to poiesis as does Foucault, because it begins to talk about what this technique involves, not just that there's this empty thing called a technique that you just have to figure out what this is, but it involves some kind of rhythm, some kind of beat, some kind of intensity. That these are all aspects of the techna, attributes, you might want to say, or affects even, as Deleuze will get into.
But then the autoposis is even more interesting because the auto, or in the way I understand it, coming from within, is usually understood as a singularity, but it's actually plurality. And the poiesis itself, the poiesis is understood plurally, but it's not. I don't know.
Oh, my machine is just being so bizarre. Okay, Barnaby, maybe your comment, Barnaby or Dario's comments on, in your case, the autopoiesis of your algorithmic creatures drawing, and Barnaby's comment about the human being inside a tier. Does any of this sound like you could develop it from what Julia's saying?
Yes, in the sense that auto, like, is the same. It's not degenerative in a way. Okay, so there's this thing just generating itself.
It's not generative, or it is generative?
It isn't generative in
a generative way.
Yeah, because the generative has the beginning, and that's the trouble with it. Like, you have the kickoff that starts generating as a starting point. So that's why I think.
But if you start with the plural.
Exactly. Then it's.
If the auto is
Yeah,
in fact plural, which is what you were saying, right?
Yeah,
That's how I. That's the escape from this generative model that starts at one point. So it
Oh, I
starts,
see, right,
yeah.
okay, I'm with you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is how we relate this autopoiesis, which is actually also crazy because to auto means the same.
And the same is a belonging.
And this is where I wanted to go into Heidegger.
Yes.
And because the Heidegger is not only talking about belonging, but belonging together. And making the distinction. So how is he getting from metaphysics is by. So he's saying that Hegel is placing the weight in belonging together on together. So there's completion of the thought and being. So they're becoming the same. And Heidegger is saying, coming from A equals A, that it's still belonging together, but the emphasis is on belonging. So through this belonging, they, the thought and the being are attracted to each other and do not collapse into each other. And then we come to the event of appropriation.
Don't do that yet?
Okay,
Just
okay,
stick
so
with Spinoza now, between the body, and who brought that up? Was it, Anya, was that you that brought up the thing about Spinoza and the body and the mind? Oh, no. Yeah, can you, it's like hot potato. Can you go with the hot potato now?
I guess the plurality somehow is in that parallelism. So the body is not reducible to the mind is not reducible to the body, and the two allow us to finding out what the body can do can sort of also become a method for like finding out what the mind can
So is it
do.
possible, so what you were saying earlier though, that they belong together, right?
Yeah.
So emphasis on belong as
Yeah.
opposed to together.
Yeah.
So can there be a mind, as it were, or a thought without
Yeah.
a body?
without a body? No.
Good. Can there be a body without a thought?
No.
Okay, it's getting harder. Okay, okay.
I would say yes.
Why is that?
Why is that?
I mean, why cannot be a
I mean, if, like, okay, so I didn't think maybe stones don't have thoughts in Spinoza, I don't know, I'm not that far yet, but certainly for, if you're talking humans, then no, there is no abstract thought without.
Okay, but can there be a thought without a body?
My guess would be no, but it would just be a guess.
I'm going to go with yes.
me too, I think.
Do you wanna explain why, other than the fact that you're just being ornery?
Because the thought has a as Spinoza's we've just read has can be closed off by another thought, so it takes a finite form in its expression. Then it starts to have an autonomous autopoietic existence in its objective form, and it can be also with Spinoza. I think it can follow this extension. So it has a geometry which escapes the body, and it certainly escapes the author.
Do you think that Spinoza has a name for that? That thought that doesn't have a body?
God, substance.
God, substance. Is that what we're talking about when we're talking about artificial intelligence?
No.
But that was resounding.
I mean, I think that the thing is that it's because it's the thought is substance. It is both an object, and it is the extension is also a continuum, but it's in a dynamic. It has dynamism when it's got escape velocity. I don't know the artificial intelligence.
Okay, well, just
But
drop
if
that. I just
there's-
thought I'd throw that in just to be annoying.
If there's
Yeah.
if there's a thought without a body, and let's say it's autopoietic, well then the answer is yes. Then the answer is either no.
Yes,
Then
the
it's
answer
not-
is yes or no.
No.
Excellent.
Yeah, the answer is not yes or no. Like it's plural. I mean.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
But no, I mean,
No.
so surely artificial intelligence, as we are aware of it, always has a body. I mean, it always has a material substrate. It wouldn't be able to. An algorithm on a piece of paper is not doing anything.
Even it would be still having a body, and this
But
paper
yeah,
would be
the
the body
body.
of the algorithm.
Yeah, but yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
so it never. I don't know.
Yeah.
And if it was in your head, then it would be your brain. I don't know.
It comes back to what Spinoza talks about, the idea of what is free. That
Where does he say this?
it's point number 7. It's definition number 7. If it's its own nature causes it to act as it does, which kind of is strange because it's complicated in that it implies that well, it implies AI in a sense, but way before.
Yeah, you gotta love these guys.
But at the same time, it's because he's talking about God. It's kind of almost, it's kind of impossible for anything to do that because everything is bound to God and caused by causes.
Yeah, it's a bit of an excuse.
So
Excuse.
it's hard.
That damn Spinoza.
So the thought is it's got a dwelling. It's got a dwelling. It's not so much a body, but if it creates its own body, it does so autonomously. That's the kind of so it's an autopoietic
That's the
dwelling.
kind of thing it is.
Yeah,
That's right.
but I mean that's what Spinoza is going for.
Yeah,
right?
can you say it again? Sorry, I didn't mean to be.
So it's left the thinker's body, but it's now got, because it's got a finite structure, it has its own body which it's created for itself in a auto-poetic way. So I've lost my train of thought there, but something you just said.
Then there is no thought and no body anymore. Like
It's a but it's dwelling somewhere.
but this is still saying A equals A. No,
Yeah.
the body equals the mind. It's
No, I don't think so.
no.
No,
No.
I think it
Yep,
goes
but
beyond.
we got Anna, who's just come back from Australia and still awake. It's a miracle.
I just wanted to bring something in as like the way that you understand the body, and what if you understand wave as a body and thought as a wave, and when it shifts, which you kind of like mentioned body is something like material, and it's still referring to atoms and particles, but the moment when particle comes wave, it also shifts. So,
Yeah,
Thank
which
you,
is
Anna.
which is Penrose, which is what Penrose talks about.
Okay,
Yeah,
where?
in Shadows of Jahannam.
No, I know.
I can't remember, but I remember reading.
You have to try and, I know this is painful,
I can't remember, but he does talk
you have
about
to try
it.
and remember where you remember it.
I can't.
Because when you're handing in your thesis, I hate to bring up the T word, it will go into Turnitin, and Turnitin will look for your footnotes and it will find them. If you, we'll find that you don't have them like that.
I don't have footnotes in my
But
head.
besides that, who cares about Turnitin? The fact of the matter is you need to know where it's coming from.
But if Spinoza was operating now, I wonder whether things would lead to God or whether they would lead to AI. You know, whether God is a sort of holding pattern or, you know, the potentiality of sort of,
Absolutely.
you know, it seems to me to leave things in an irresolvable resolve, if that makes sense. You say, well, beyond that is then God, or that would lead to God. Sort of, it's like empty, you know, cubby hole.
Yep,
Put
yep.
things into and say, well, that's that. But if he was operating now, it's likely that that wouldn't be the
Which is one of the reasons
place.
why he's so current, actually. Which is bring up Spinoza, very interesting. Yeah, can anybody else, Adam, you were against some of the things that were being said. Is this making it seem as though, is it resolving some of the questions that you had, or is you're still got your position?
What was my position?
You were basically saying that it was incorrect, I understood you saying, it was incorrect to have the specificity of the infinite worked out in such a way that you could be doing something without a political action. That, in other words, there's ethics somewhere, but the way in which this was all being discussed, it got rid of the ethical move, it got rid of the meaningful move.
And getting rid of the A's now.
Yeah.
And just the being left with the equal sign.
No, I wasn't saying.
I might have misheard.
I wasn't saying that that was problematic. I was saying
Oh,
I'm
the-
not there with knowing what the alternative, because I feel it's necessary.
Mhm.
So.
Because you see, the reason I came back to you on this is because, as you know, and I wish I could get up on my screen, but I can't, but this whole argument is being presented in Spinoza's work under the title ethics, not under the title nothingness or, time or even God. It's under ethics. So politically, he's doing something political in his time by presenting this argument under the rubric of ethics, which must be annoying for anyone who read it and knew immediately that he was debunking God by saying God is everywhere, God is nowhere, and all the rest of this kind of stuff. But anyway, and I think that, Emma, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that Spinoza's the way in which he develops his arguments is as though he, you know, were on the same page with Hales and the rest of them, you know, like having this discussion about how substances are created from plurality. We start with a plurality, we don't start with a one. In the beginning, there was a plurality. That's what Heidegger starts with as well. In the beginning, there was speech, not the word. There was this, you know, and in fact, the big debates between Foucault and Derrida in part came down to which came first, writing or, you know, speech or writing. And Limited Ink, if you get a chance to look at that, the big debates between Derrida and Searle, John Searle and so on. Derrida basically argues, and in fact, in a certain sense, won the day by saying that text came first, that the mark comes first, and after the mark comes speech. And Foucault vehemently argued against it, saying no, the orality comes first. And that's that kind of like, it's like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. You know, you're either one or the other, but you're not both, or very rare, you know, that you like both. Because one is saying that somehow you're dealing with that deep cut, the trace, the you know, something to do with the tympan, the quasi-transcendental, that's Derrida. The other is saying you have nothing to do with this transcendental. There's nothing to do with this kind of tracing. There has to be, everything has to do with inventing, not discovering one's sexuality, but inventing it, or whatever the various things are. One's inventing subjectivity as opposed to finding it. And for Foucault, for example, he does that argument because he situates orality or orality or the speech as the ground, as the first position, but that's because he's presenting the plurality. And he's following, I mean, Deleuze, Foucault, they're all following the same kind of.
So how did Derrida win that one?
Ah, yes.
So art comes first.
Sorry?
Art comes first.
Art
according
always comes
to
first, but not because we can make an
the
argument.
mark.
I don't know, comes, what do you mean?
But art comes first. If the
Why is
if
the mark writing rather than art?
Why is the mark writing?
Yeah, rather than
He
art.
writes about that in, I can't remember, I can't cite it, but when he talks about the blind man and then the pencil or the charcoal, it's that one, I can't remember what it is, but he's like, yeah, it's like needing the tool or the vehicle to kind of, you're finding, again, it's a transcendental thing, you're finding your way through the dark, if you're the blind man drawing, or I can't remember what it is. I've read it a long time ago. I'm gonna shut up.
No, but you did good up to that point.
It's that, yeah. It's the
Okay.
it's the gesture that's a physical thing. It's
So
about
close.
searching and not. I need to read it again.
Okay.
Can I go back to the thought and
I can't remember.
if it exists in us or outside of us or all of that? It's because it's a term that I can't remember what it is, where the thought of you inside of me is in existence, and therefore when I leave you and I still retain the thought, that thought, my memory of it is non-local, but that's not what it is. Does anybody?
I don't know if I followed you there. I'm really sorry.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so try that again. How am I in you or you're in me and then you left? No, seriously, I mean, what do you mean by that?
I'm thinking about you, and then I leave. So where are you? Are you in me, or are you there? It's that here there thing, I think.
Well,
and
I'm definitely not in you.
But
No,
my
no, seriously,
memory
I'm
is, but my memory is of non-locality. That it's a non-localized existence.
Be careful with those terms.
That's
They're
the
new.
thing.
They're-
It's
they're-
not the
You're
right
like, you're
term.
like taking baby steps with big terms. So
It's
be
not the
careful.
right term.
Be careful, because non-locality doesn't mean that you're somewhere and then you go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Non-locality means that two things are operating simultaneously at the same time, doing exactly the same thing. And it doesn't matter how far apart they are technically.
Oh, I see.
So,
Oh.
yeah, That's the non-locality.
But the memory of someone inside of oneself has an existence which well, that's it really. I sort of
Okay, so let's look at it this way. So we know that in Hegel, we talked about this today in the remedials, who want to be called remedials. Okay, do you want to say that? Not me, you know, we came up with another term, pretanglers, but they wanted to go back to remedials, which I like. You know, anyway, what we were talking about is the fact that in Hegel, when the is, or the know thing, is sublated by intuition, and intuition then becomes big intuition, and then that gets sublated by sense certainty. Sense certainty and intuition form the first, let's say, step of consciousness. The second, that's consciousness A. Consciousness B becomes when all of that gets sublated into perception, and then that again gets sublated into understanding. That's consciousness B. That's like a kind of a more clarified version. And so in a certain sense, it's, I don't know, inside is not quite the right way of putting it, but it's part of the subject, this consciousness. Whereas in the Heideggerian move, you don't have this internal, external positioning. You have the connections. You have the way in which thinking operates is that it doesn't operate in these kind of like, there's like perception, and there's intuition, and there's all these sort of hierarchical stages. There are ways in which one has the techna gets involved, and therefore there's a skilled environment around which the pluralities are constituted. It's not that Heidegger or any of those people are actually trying to figure out, first there's A, and then there's B, and then there's C, and then there's practical, and then it has to do with, this is why you can't actually say what are the actual technical skills you'll need to become a good painter, let's say. Well, on one hand, you could say that probably, and on the other hand, you can't say that at all. And on the third hand, it doesn't have anything to do with painting, and so on and so forth. You know what I mean? So it has all of that moving around in it. Is this at all settling? B, what are you hearing on all of this? Nothing. Leave me alone. Yeah, leave you alone? Okay. Okay. Anybody else want to say anything? No?
I have the feeling that the techno is still single.
It's just a single, gotta go on a dating site. Yeah.
That's by itself, and that's a bit disappointing.
It is a bit disappointing. Well, poor Heidegger, I mean, you know, he didn't figure it, he didn't get there.
I'm a bit lost with this sort of plurality, though, the plural identity. I kind of got a bit lost when that sort of, you said it's the identity difference that together makes the plural, but I thought we kind of needed, we had the plural before we even got to that's the A is a plural A.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really, don't
So,
understand
okay, so
how
shall we go
that,
back to difference then in Heidegger? Would that be helpful?
well, I'd like,
Or should we stick with?
well, just to sort of like kind of, you said that it was you know, why is it A equals A, and not A? I think that's a good question. That's the kind of sort of, probably why most people are in the room, if they kind of, you know, found themselves to be Heideggerians. Perish the thought. But if you just sort of then step in and say, but the reason that happens is because the A is plural, I don't think that does the trick. Why doesn't it just say a plural A when it's, you know, could be kind of A squared or A cubed or A to the power of something like that, you know.
Because
loads of
the
A's.
question isn't how many A's can you fit in an A, but the question is, what is A? And A belongs to this entity that makes it have meaning. It doesn't really have to have any meaning other than squiggle equals squiggle. It doesn't, you know, A means something to us because we know it's the first letter of an alphabet and we use it to, so it takes on a lot of other parts. But in order for something to have meaning, it is to say that its meaning gets constituted. So this becomes absolutely essential for, you know, let's say Foucault, for example, when he's talking about creating identities. Identities aren't an essence, they're created, right? And in Judith Butler's position, she's talking about performing, the performing of the identity, but that performance is linked with a dialectical move. So she has to recuperate it back into the subject.
Yeah.
But I didn't answer your question then.
Well, no, that's, I mean, I mean, it seems that you can't talk about plurality, I mean, I know it's not really Heidegger's thing, but without kind of thinking about it as a dialectic thing, or to be slightly more controversial, is sort of pre-Lapsarian idea of Edenic A, this plurality, and then suddenly there's this, it seems that there must be some kind of thing which makes the consciousness of plurality form, which is then A equals A. So the plurality must be in some kind of pre-conscious A.
Wow, okay, I'm not sure where to go with this, because I can see what you're getting at. I think that the problem here, it's both a very simple problem and a very complicated one, in the sense that plurality is not the same thing as many. We're there, right? Mm-hmm. Many is made up of a lot of elements that can be points, they can be lines, they can be waves, they can be whatever they are, but they're elements. Plurality could be points, lines, waves, and so on, but they're dimensions. So they don't have edges to them. They're not an objective. They're not an object in the way that either Hegel or Marx, or for that matter anybody else, who understands the object in either a Newtonian sense, that it exists in such a way that two objects can't occupy the same place at the same time, for example. I'm only using that one because people are familiar with that part of Newton. But the object has an architecture to it in ways that mean that it is finite, whereas in the newer form, as it were, the form that it gets ushered in with Maxwell and the quantum physicists and Bohr and that whole crowd, the object is it's plural in the sense that it has a structure, it has an architecture to it. So like E equals mc squared, for example, is one of the architectures of one of the types. But its architecture is based on the notion of the infinite, and the infinite can only be understood in its cohesions, and the cohesions are are their elements then. So rather than the many being one, that taken together creates a multitude of things, that's the basis of a Newtonian move. In the sort of post-Newtonian move, what you have is a rethinking of the infinite that is connected, whose elements are connected with these cohesions. And
So it's infinite A.
you could say, perhaps you could say infinite A, I'd be willing to say that, yeah. But Spinoza is the first to come up with that, because he gets into the notions of compossible and incompossible. Leibniz tries to further this, but he gets into this whole question of extension. So what's the extension of the body? Or what, if you want to throw a thought, I want to throw a thought out. What is that? What is this move, this throwing that goes, or the thrownness, as Heidegger will start talking about? When one has this thrownness, when something is thrown, and who knows where it, quote, lands, well, it's not really been literally thrown, it's not really landing, because there's, first of all, no ground, and there's no real throwing. But in fact, what happens is that this multiplicity of cohesions are taken together to create the assemblage of what it becomes here, or even there. B, are you following this? Yeah? No. Were you gonna say something?
No.
No, okay, so I keep thinking you were gonna say something, but it's just a twitch. Does anyone wanna say anything? Does just like,
Could sorry to hold the floor, this A, could you also say, apart from saying infinity A, instead of plurality, but plenum, Plenum,
yeah,
you could say that it's a plenum. Is a plenum a plurality?
I don't know. I'm not sure. How are you using it to develop that?
the notion of, well, again, a continuity, but more oceanic, more with currents and waves, and as waves, but not a surface, but a kind of just a sort of a body of far more kind of liquidy, but of sort of a fullness in an ontological sense rather than a kind of surrounding sense. I think it's it's a term that Jung uses, but I think he's taking it from the scriptures or something like this.
Does anybody get any mileage out of thinking that everything is a surface? This table's a surface, the ocean's a surface.
Definitely, if there's tensions there, then you've got this absolute, impossibly fast multiplication of planes, because you've got the sort of the tension, which suddenly it has to the tension erected through like a kind of planal geometry, so it starts to sort of then become very, very, very sort of hyper intricate.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go on.
I'm maybe on a sort of different tab, because I'm listening to that description and I was thinking about restitutions.
It's about what?
Restitutions.
Restitutions.
Heidegger Shapiro argument that Derrida works through when he applies it to Van Gogh's painting Workman's Boots. So in that sense, unless I'm maybe being too literal about it, your description of surface and complexity seems to leave out a kind of, and this is going to be put in the wrong way, but I want to say it kind of leaves out a depth of being that in restitutions in this argument, I think Heidegger is trying to make sense of. So the idea of surface and many surfaces, for me, doesn't serve that idea fully enough. But I could be being very literal when I say that, but I just sort of get a sense, only from, because you were talking about Derrida, and it made me just think about restitutions is a really interesting moment in reading representation. Can you remember that bit?
I
You were saying,
can't. No.
I read it ages ago, and it's like the blind man with
Yeah,
the charcoal.
no.
and
That's
that.
right,
I was
yeah,
like, you
that's
should
right.
get that.
I can't.
Shoes without anyone in them.
That's
Yeah,
right.
No, I can remember that, but I can't as well at the same time. I have read it.
I mean, it's worth probably reading for next time, or at some point, the restitutions. Yeah, I think it's quite a good one.
But do you think that it relates to what Barnaby was saying? Like, so it's the opposite of it's not even.
Well, I think that it's not a good thing to, it's not, I don't mean in a judgmental sense, I mean that to think everything is a surface is it's a problem. If, in fact, when one's thinking it that way, it's thought in such a way that it means that we really just have no dimensionalities, we just have, I don't know, a plane of immanence.
No, I suppose.
So that's what I was worried about, that's why I started coming up with like weird.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking more of like Lyotard's tensor from the libidinal economy.
Yeah.
This kind of sort of almost like sort of a contorted muscle in some sort of libidinal interior, which is all surface, but you can kind of, although it has kind of like a torsion to it, it also, one can walk in a straight line if one thinks about this, and always get back to the same place. This kind of I suppose he also calls it the libidinal band, doesn't it?
Yeah.
This kind of
which is also a Mobius band, and
yeah,
it's also an economy and so on
yeah.
and so forth.
So sort of this kind of this sort of something which is you know, you can draw a line, even a straight line, between any sort of point on this surface, but it doesn't look like a single plane. It's this sort of twisted muscle.
So maybe not a better way of putting it, but maybe a more accessible way of putting this is to understand what you're saying, and stroke what Leotard's saying, is a form of method as opposed to an actual object. It's a form of inquiry, it's a form of framing. This is why I was going to read from Anne Catherine Hale's the chapter on, you know, we have to figure, or what's called, we have to transform the way we think. Because what that means, or what I took it to mean from what she was writing, is that one has to understand that the path that one is on is a form of a method, whatever that path is. And you don't need to know where you're going on it, but you need to have some kind of sensibility of how to read the markers as you go, or how to make them up, whatever it is. And that ability is what your method is. You know, and some people will argue, which I think you're arguing, Barnaby, but maybe I'm wrong about that, is that there is no such thing as an epistemology, there's only a method. Other people will argue that there's no such thing as a method, only an epistemology, and some people will argue that there's neither. Not who those people are, but I just assume that will be the group. You know, so, but I think that in the piece that you're citing, which I think is quite an important piece, particularly for what we're talking about, because it becomes clear, because what Derrida does is kind of surfs the question around how one is dealing with method and epistemology, and he does it in this way where he pits them against each other and then kind of rides it out, and you get this sense he doesn't resolve it. Again, he gets into this, you know, the undecidable. This is very Derridian. He's taking this right out of the Gödel move. And so the limit, when he talks about limit or trace or so on, what's so frustrating, I find, with a lot of people who are Derridians, is that they think he's talking about the excluded middle. In fact, he's thinking about the undecidable. You know, and the undecidable trace is a totally different animal than the excluded middle trace. And so you have a whole group of people that go into this whole question of how he's talking about the deep abyss or the abyss, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, just coming at it from another thing, but I'm just trying to find the quote and I can't. I think Achille Mbembe in the Critique of Black Reason talks about Heidegger and criticizes Heidegger, and I just wanted to bring back into the discussion the political, because I think it's interesting that Heidegger comes up with A equals A, and that's supposed to be, and putting difference at the heart of identity, and that's supposed to be the move that he makes to exonerate himself from the Nazi situation that he was involved in and profiting of. And there's like a way that I think it's Mbembe, but I need to find it, talks about the fact, and I was wondering whether that might relate to the Irigaray argument about the forgetting of air as well, that there's a kind of, on the one hand you could say, oh, beautiful move, differences at the heart of identity, but then on the other hand he says something like, even difference has to be owned by, like, let's say the white man concept of the being. So it's like it has to have everything, and it has to even have that internal to it. So it doesn't really need any kind of outside in that sense. And I think this is where we're getting a little bit stuck, because we're talking about, like Adam brought up the idea of, do we need tension? You know, you're going around, what is this plurality at the beginning? And I think Heidegger's just maybe led us down the garden path and got us stuck in a corner where the answers to the questions are, we're just in this clearing. I don't know, but I think that might be, and I sort of feel like having as little as I've read of Spinoza so far, because he thinks politically, actually, like the main, at least the way Deleuze describes it, the main questions that concern Spinoza is like, why are human beings living in this shitty political situations and perpetuate them that he himself lives in and feels really oppressed by historically and in his thoughts. So even though he uses this very abstract language to present his case, his aim ultimately is not abstract at all.
He's also living in one of the most enlightened sort of city countries in the world, isn't he, at the time?
He has access to, he has access to, like, through there's a short biography, he has access to a lot of different teachings and influences, and but actually the persecution and the kind of assassination of thinkers and stuff like that within that context and his publishers is really rife. And so I just wanted to bring it back to the idea that there is kind of, we're not just like placing little arrangements in empty space, and we might need to be very careful about Heidegger and resituate them. And also I'm going to try and find Mbembe and send it around.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah. Does anyone want to comment on that so far? Because I think that one of the things that maybe we could just move on slightly is then thinking about what is difference in a political sense, or in a sense that gives it its ability to not only be like the God particle, as Grant was saying, but to offer something with ethics, offer something with the political. It's like, the gift that keeps giving, difference. So, I mean, in Leotard, it becomes the differand, so that he's able to talk about the Jews and that the difference becomes the inability to speak. So in a moment where speech is the beginning, as it were, the beginning of the plurality, and when speech is removed as a collective group. So any oh, good. Good. Come back in. So the question, I'm glad you're back.
Yeah, hi, sorry.
That's right. So the question is, what gives difference its power, in a certain sense, to be so political? Or, we could look at Deleuze's chapter 3, the image of thought, where he develops this what is political, but different from his perspective, and how he sort of solves tries to solve the Heideggerian move, which doesn't work. Or we could look at Catherine Hale's work, or we could just try and guess ourselves. What do you think? Were you exhausted? Well, you've been very quiet. Do you feel like talking?
I don't know if this is probably bringing a totally different thing into the equation, so it's why I've been holding back, but I was thinking about technique and magic as two kind of belonging but opposing forces. So we're talking about like writing, autopoiesis, reason, the excluded middle, and Hegel is kind of all belonging to technique.
No, that doesn't belong to tech.
Is it part of, it's kind of...
The Hegelian move belongs to a dialectical positioning.
Right.
So, I mean, I suppose, I don't know if this is maybe the most useful way of discussing it in what I'm going to say next, but when we sort of say that techna is closer to how one would think about the alchemy, different transformations, the way in which that would happen based on a different set of logics than the logic of the universal. I mean, that's a short version. So, in fact, what, not Deleuze, but Gibbons and a couple other of the sort of quantum philosopher types develop is the term multiversal. So they start getting into this, so the way in which one is trying to develop this question of the plural, and the groundless ground of the plural is to talk about the way in which it creates not a universal, but a multiversal. Now, I'm not sure that works because multi immediately implies many, so we're back to the problem of the individual segments coming together to put this into one. And I think it's helpful to perhaps think in alchemic terms if it helps, or so-called magic terms, questions of spells and so on, if you think that that will help you not think about an ingredient as such, or an element as such. One has to think about these markers that don't have edges. And that's, so it's a very, let's say, ephemeral move. But you could think about your computer in that sense, and how you can work on your screen. But if I broke open my computer, I would not find, Spinoza sitting in there. In fact, as it turns out, I can't even get Spinoza on the screen even without breaking it open. But, it's gonna be so annoying. Anyway, but it's the way in which one begins to understand, see, on some level, because we're dealing with computers, we're dealing with iPads, we're dealing with all this kind of stuff that has image, sound, stuff going on, and yet there isn't, the 50,000 music things within the entity. Somehow it's created, we know it's created, it's sitting in there, we can hear the songs and so on. So how does one take the kind of knowledge and understand it as the multiple cohesion that creates different entities? And so these guys are way before the computer, so that's what we're trying to get at here. But just to think that the Hegel, if you think of Hegel, think of dialectic. Basically, I mean, it's a very crude way to discuss Hegel. So sorry about that, Hegelians out there on TV land. But it's probably the most useful at the moment to try and get a sense of that. Mariana, do you have any thoughts on this? I'm gonna pick on the people who are silent.
I'm constantly thinking about this. I went to an exhibition recently in Rotterdam from an artist called Pilar Mata de Pont, and I'm sorry, I have to take a detour, but maybe it's good.
Yeah, it's a good detour. Detour's good.
She made a video about a certain reserved area in somewhere in Australia that I forgot the name. But it's pretty much what happened was in the 1920s, a British couple who owned this reserve, because they owned it, went there and hired a very expensive architect. They rebuilt the whole area and inserted certain species that started to destroy the land. So, for example, they planted loads of lilies, and lilies started to eat the passion fruits, and now you have rangers that have to take all the lilies away, like lilies bit by bit. Anyway, in the middle of this, there was this man who was the guide for her shooting, and he was talking about the whole. There's a side video about this process, where they have to go through an entire ritual of purification, both spiritual and physical. So the physical part was that so that the snakes wouldn't bite them, and the spiritual part would be the respected part of the land. And I think that none of this has, in our vocabulary, none of this has something tangible that we can compare to. Yet it doesn't mean that it's not. I started to think about this because of the thought without a body, and body without a thought, and I kind of, to be honest, I just got lost in this kind of thought that is not really possible to compare with anything that we are talking about, is it?
Ayurvedic.
Sorry?
Like an experience like Ayurvedic.
Yeah.
Something like that, which is the notion that some other being enters your body and then reveals to you these moments of consciousness, or unconscious revelations that are then pictured for you via this other being.
But for me, this is a certain coexistence of differences in the sense that it's not tangible for me, but it doesn't mean that I cannot think through you. I can absorb that experience without having had that experience, and probably will never have that experience.
But a difference is not otherness. Okay, so I just want to
But
throw
it's
that out.
not sameness either.
It's not, no, it's definitely not, otherness and sameness sort of belong in the same group.
Yeah. But it's also a way of thinking without edges, because this kind of other,
That's right.
this
It's very hard.
experience that is different than mine does not have any edges for me. Does not have any. I cannot visualize it. I cannot give a sense of understanding to it. Yet I can understand it. So I'm a little bit lost in this other way of perceiving what is.
So I'm gonna throw in another whole thing so that
Sorry.
one can be as completely lost as possible, so we can we can be in this seminar in our lost state. But I don't know how many people have come across different creation myths. I mean, we all know the creation myth for the, you know, Judeo-Christian creation myths, Muslim creation myths, but you know, there's like one of my favorite creation myths is the Navajo creation myth, which basically suggests that people began in the middle of the earth, and the people had different colors, and the colors were, I think, pink, green, blue, yellow, and something else, and there was I get the myths mixed up, but there's like various gods that are involved in trying to come to the surface. So the whole thing of the creation myth is trying to come to the surface of Earth. So they're in the core of the Earth, they're trying to come to the surface. And what happens is that the various peoples, the blue people, let's just say, end up, the thing that's particular about the Navajo myth is that the peoples are all incestuous. And they keep sleeping with with themselves, as it were, in the family. And they also, when they leave their area, they incestuously start sleeping with everybody that they come upon. And so they get into arguments with, like, the blue people get into arguments with the yellow people, and they're thrown out of the yellow people's camp. So the blue people keep going till they can find another group, and they find another group, and the same thing happens. They start sleeping with each other and everybody, and it always keeps opening up into this huge orgy. I mean, it's fantastic, you know, creation myth, and then that doesn't work because everybody gets mad at each other, and at some point, somehow they have a certain amount of days where this works, and then it goes on for about 28 days or something, which is a cycle, menstrual cycle, and then something doesn't work right because everybody's sleeping with everybody, and everybody gets mad at everybody, so they leave again, and they keep going through the different cores of the earth, the different, you know, sediments of the earth, until they finally come to this area that is this beautiful sort of liquid area, which has lakes or something, but they don't quite put it like this. It's got a lot of liquids, and the air feels good. In fact, it's the air, so they're not in the middle of the earth. And they decide that they're not going to sleep with everybody this time, and so they don't, and that's how the Navajo is born. And so that, to me, is a very interesting form of a creation myth, and for a society to live amongst this kind of a myth, just like the myth that is the foundation of, you know, the Judeo-Christian society, maybe Judeo-Muslim Christian society, but certainly not Hindu, because the Hindu has too many gods and it's just too complicated, and the Greek version also has too many gods and it's also too complicated. So you have this sort of monotheistic creation is also the universal, is connected to the universal notion. Whereas the Navajo has more of the multiversal thing going on. There's these plural, I mean, I've explained this in a terrible way that I'm sorry to anybody who's Navajo listening to this, but you should have if you have a chance, you should read any of these sort of other creation myths, because it helps one think outside of this monotheistic culture. And that's what Spinoza was trying to do to start with. He was trying to present a monotheistic position without getting beheaded, which is a tough thing to do in that time. You know, without standing up against, you know, the church or the temple or the synagogues or whatever. Are you hearing that? Okay, good.
Your description of Navajo reminds me of the Platonic idea that the sort of inherent class system, where didn't Plato kind of say that there are people who are sort of gold people and bronze people, and there's a sort of class system.
Yeah, so
And you shouldn't. Sorry.
That's Hesiod.
Say again.
That's Hesiod.
Yeah.
He's here.
Not Plato.
I thought it was Plato. I thought
No,
in the
it's
Republic.
five genders of Hesiod.
I thought in the Republic you get that sort of idea that there's this sort of metal-based class system, and you shouldn't marry outside. You know, you shouldn't populate outside of that system because you'll sully the gold people, the bronze people. I think that's in the Republic.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying it's not elsewhere. But it seems to me it's just giving an excuse for slavery, and then after the event you're saying, oh, it's okay because they're sort of low-level bronze people, so it's okay to shit on them because it's a fact of life, right? Presumably the Navajo, did their different colours represent different levels in society, or was it?
No, they're different myths, because the colors were sometimes bird people, they were like hybrid people.
Okay.
They were hybrid environments of sentient beings, basically. And so they called them people, but they're actually these hybrids. But I was just going to say that with the Platonic move, that's based not so much on the fact there's the bronze, silver, the metal group, the bronze, silver, gold people, but based on telos. And so so in fact they're still dealing with the teleological move that's going on, whereas other creation moves aren't bringing this kind of telos. And I think that, rightly or wrongly, well, and also horrifically on many levels, the move that Heidegger makes that is then taken up in various ways with the postmodernist and the modernist is attempting to get away from telos. Is attempting to think difference in a way that will enable actual thinking to make a doing as opposed to an applying, an encounter as opposed to a manifest destiny kind of scenario. I think we should leave it at this. I think that we've had enough for today, unless people want to say anything else. What do you think? Can I say more? You did?
I just wanted to say that if you don't want to use the Navajo myth because it could be hurtful, you can always refer to Favier Butler's trilogy, The Myth's Brut, where there are these different ways of procreating. So you always need three beings, one that passes the genes from one to the other and mixes them in between, and that are different, all of them represent different layers of society, but they're all necessary for the earth, let's say, to continue existing. And yeah, it's like
There's also green porno, which you should also take a look at, Isabella Rossellini.
Yes.
It is absolutely fantastic because she looks at all different bugs and insects and how they procreate, and it's amazing. I mean, not that we have to end up on sex here, but why not? But green porno, it's totally hilarious. She shows herself up as a worm and a bug and a spider and various other things. It's worth listening to and seeing. Okay, so next week we're going to try it again, or not. Shall we try it again with Spinoza? And we've got. I feel like we're building a house that Jack built here. We have Hegel, which you may or may not be getting into your belts. We have Catherine N. Hales. We have Penrose, and we have Heidegger. We have Deleuze's take on Heidegger. And who else should we have? Should we throw in? And let's do Irigaray. Okay. Because we're missing some.
The Forgetting of the Air?
What? Which one?
Forgetting of the Air?
The Forgetting of Air, but I think that the one that you had mentioned.
Yeah.
The intimate requires self-esteem, and it's in
Intimate request?
the intimate requires separate dwelling.
Is that in the book?
I'm just looking at
But next week is the fall.
Is it what week?
Is reading week.
Oh, is it the whole across us? Is that
Next week, it doesn't, there's no entanglement there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not marked.
Well,
It was.
I always have it.
Okay.
We will have entanglement of
It's,
death.
it's in
It's a cake or death.
key writing.
Key writing.
Yeah.
That's the one word we don't mention very much.